Here we are again to talk aviation, and you've got me, Paul Brennan, on my own again. Martin Noakes still making his way back from Europe, in transit as we speak. He'll be with us definitely for the next show. It's been quite a busy few weeks in aviation on the home front and around the world, and there's been some significant space news this week as well, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But to start, it was inevitable, wasn't it, that there would be at some point a near-miss confrontation between an airliner and a drone. And that seems to have happened here in the last week with an Air New Zealand pilot spotting a drone nearby his A320 on a flight out of Christchurch. The TV3 news site reports that Air New Zealand says no evasive action was needed Friday afternoon when the pilot flying the A320 with 166 people aboard believed he spotted a red drone at 6,000 feet above Kaiapoi, well above a 400-foot limit. The Air New Zealand safety officer, Captain Dave Morgan, says it was reckless behaviour by a drone operator who so far had not had the courage to come forward and address their behaviour with authorities. But people are sceptical, and I'm one of them. When you think about this incident, the altitude at which it took place, the description reported by the pilot, you start to wonder what in fact he was or she was seeing. I'm not a drone operator, but I've tried to keep up with the drone thing, and Martin's certainly a drone expert. He reads a lot about drones and is very interested in them and the way they work. And as far as I'm aware, you'd be lucky to find a consumer-grade drone that could get to 6,000 feet, let alone be controllable over that distance and have the telemetry and monitoring needed to fly it properly. I guess they can be flown automatically, maybe, but it seems that that's a very extreme operating environment for a simple drone. And then for the pilot to be able to identify this drone in, I would imagine, the very limited time that he or she had to spot this thing and sort of follow it as they flew past it. A reasonable speed, one would think, at that altitude. Jared Wadhams, owner of Christchurch's Helicam Pro, and this again is a quote from the TV3 news story on it, he says he's been monitoring industry chat rooms about the incident. The general sense is the pilot doesn't know what he's talking about or has some kind of agenda to get rid of drones, he told NZ Newswire. Anything reaching 6,000 foot was a pretty serious machine, but no local commercial drones were coloured red, and it definitely would not be a kid's drone, which couldn't reach that height, he said. Anyone who had certification to fly that high would immediately contact air traffic control if their machine went astray. And he also questioned whether a pilot could spot a drone at 6,000 feet. Mr. Wadham said it could possibly have been a microlight, a rogue surf kite, or a remote control aeroplane. There were a lot of myths about aircraft hitting drones, but they were no more scary than bird strikes, he said. So that's interesting. Tim Brooks, director of Palmerston North-based Skycam UAV, says camera drones can only get useful images between 200 and 400 feet, and there's absolutely no reason for them to fly at 6,000 feet. He says there's nothing up there. That's fairly definitive in its meaning. So what did the pilot see? And certainly the opportunity was there for great news coverage. A story like this is going to be jumped on by the media, and of course passengers have a fear of flying, many of them anyway, so this will get them listening or buying, the newspaper, which has this splashed all over the front page. And the Civil Aviation Authority says it's treating the incident as a near miss and is investigating. It's assuming the drone pilot was unaware of new rules which came into effect last month. Well, again, 6,000 feet? And the comment that hitting a normal-sized drone is really no different from hitting a bird, though hitting a bird can be dangerous, especially if it's sucked into the engine, is probably about right. And I imagine statistically there's probably more of a chance of hitting a bird still than a drone. But we'll keep an eye on that and see how the drone versus controlled airspace debate carries on into the future. Over the last few months, we've been talking quite a bit about the opportunities for air services between New Zealand and China. And they've been growing all the time. China's Southern already operate to Auckland. Air China is on the way. And at the end of September, in fact, the last week of September, China Eastern Airlines started their year-round service. Auckland Airport welcomed the inaugural service between Auckland and Shanghai on Saturday the 26th. 4 flights per week, and from January 2016 it will increase to daily flights. In total, the new year-round service adds 175,000 permanent seats on the route and contributes an estimated $212 million to our economy. And I'm looking at a story here on the Scoop site where Norris Carter, Auckland Airport's General Manager, Aeronautical Commercial, says the commencement of China Eastern Airlines year-round service is great news and evidence of the strong growth in air connectivity between New Zealand and China in recent years. Mr. Luan Tian, Senior Vice President of China Eastern Airlines, says the reinstatement of China Eastern Airlines Shanghai-Auckland flights has been strongly supported by the New Zealand Government and Auckland Airport. The launch of year-round flights on this route both enriches and improves our network in the Oceania region. The connection and convenience of our air network is further enhanced by China Eastern Airlines Shanghai hub, which brings even more travel choices for passengers. And that's a very good point. China Eastern Airlines is a big carrier, I think around 300 in the fleet. They fly everywhere in China and have a big network in the region and around the world. So it could be an option for quite cheap flights through to many destinations in the world for New Zealanders with this service. The first flight, by the way, landed at Auckland Airport at around 4:30 on Saturday, and it was welcomed by a water arch by 2 of the airport's Rosenbauer Panther firefighting vehicles and a porphyry by local iwi. Speaking of China, another story that we've been following recently is the possibility of an announcement that Boeing would open its first finishing facility in China. There was speculation that that would be announced around the time of Xi Jinping, the Chinese premier's visit to the United States. Well, it's now reported in the Seattle Times that the $38 billion Boeing-China deal is on and includes the first facility in China. The sale of 300 Boeing airplanes worth $38 billion to Chinese firms, the largest aerospace order ever from China, was announced during the week of the Chinese president's visit to Boeing in Seattle. The deal also includes a plan to establish a joint venture between the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, or COMAC, to open Boeing's first facility in China, which will serve as a completion and delivery centre for future 737 airliners. Details regarding the China facility are yet to be announced. Chinese airlines bought 240 airplanes, including 197 737s and 50 wide-body aircraft. The other 60 737s were bought by leasing companies, Industrial and Commercial Bank Financial Leasing Co., and the China Development Bank Leasing Company. With the expansion of both private and state-owned airlines, the Chinese commercial airplane fleet is expected to grow from 2,570 planes in 2014 to 7,210 planes in 20 years. Wow, that's amazing growth. No wonder Boeing's interested in being right in there. One of Boeing's French rivals in China is Airbus. They've already established 2 joint venture facilities with COMAC in China, the second of which is expected to deliver its first wide-body A320 jet airliner in 2018. So one country, one market, China, has such scale that the major airliner manufacturing firms, really only 2 of them, it's now crucial for their business model to have completion, finishing and even possibly assembly centres in China. And further to this story, there's an interesting article on the Vox Business and Finance website, essentially about how China is playing Boeing against Airbus to build its own airplane industry. So we just mentioned that big order of 300 new planes from Boeing to Chinese airlines and leasing companies, and the way that that is being also sort of woven into a completion, finishing, and possibly even in the future assembly centre or centres in China. The journalist behind this story I'm telling you about, one Matthew Iglesias, he says they've been playing Boeing and its major competitor off against each other to get both companies to help teach a Chinese company how to do it. And he says Lenin famously said that the capitalists will sell us the rope we use to hang them. And while neither company really wants to help create a new rival, neither is willing to cede control over the Chinese market to the other. The article goes on to say that labour unions representing Boeing's workforce are naturally concerned about the impact of the new facility in China on jobs for their members, but China's leaders are really after something much bigger, he says, than a factory full of jobs. They're trying to develop a domestic aviation industry, and to do that they need workers and managers who know how to build planes. And that's why the Chinese government state-owned aerospace company has launched a subsidiary called the Commercial Aviation Company of China, COMAC, with a mandate to build the first C919, a narrow-body aircraft intended to compete with Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320, and then with a longer-term ambition to build wide-body airplanes. And the plant Boeing is going to build in China will be used to put the finishing touches on the 737s and will handle the delivery and servicing of those aircraft. Will also be a joint venture between Boeing and COMAC. In other words, Boeing is going to be training COMAC personnel in the skills they need to complete the C919, an airplane that is designed to put Boeing out of business. And they're saying, how could Boeing be so careless about its own long-term business interests? In part, they say it's because Boeing executives need to care about the company's short-term revenue and profits, and the quarterly earnings reports don't care about COMAC's long-term vision. And that's something that Martin and I have discussed in the past too, that whole cycle of short-term reporting driving short-term goals rather than playing the long game, which is the game that China is known for playing, right? You know, thinking back to a trip I made to Melbourne in the late 90s and seeing a brand new Emirates Airlines 777-200ER come into the gate at night. Earlier in the day, I watched the departure of an Emirates A320 from Melbourne back to Dubai, presumably through Singapore. Now, that was how many years ago? Not that long ago, coming up nearly 20 years ago. And the airline, I think, started in the early 80s. It was hard to imagine then that this airline would scale to the size it is now, and that since seeing those two aircraft at work, the airline has expanded into a major global transportation system. Well, one of the members of the fleet is about to leave, and I thought I'd mention this because I got to fly on an Emirates A340-500 once, redeeming air points. I took a trip to Sydney. And that was back in the day when Emirates operated the A340-500 into Auckland, obviously, and they did that little zip across the Tasman thing. Anyway, so I got on this flight on the A340-500. I hadn't flown on an A340 before that. And thinking back to that flight, I won't forget how stable it was, how effortless it seemed to get into the air, albeit being light, only flying the Tasman and with those four very powerful Rolls-Royce engines on board, and how quiet and comfortable the ride was. I was very impressed, and I've never forgotten that. That would be in the early 2000s. Emirates ended up with 7 A340-500s in the fleet, and the last scheduled flight of an Emirates A340-500 will take place on the 3rd of October. So it's nearly over for that member of the fleet. The total passenger load was 258, according to the wiki site. Of course, one remembers back to an incident that occurred in Melbourne back in 2009 involving Emirates Flight 407 flying from Melbourne to Dubai, A340-500. The flight failed to take off properly at Melbourne Airport, hitting several structures at the end of the runway. I'm quoting here from the wiki page, before eventually climbing enough to return to the airport for a safe landing. Although no fatalities or injuries resulted from this accident, it was severe enough to be classified by the Australian Transportation Safety Bureau as a significant event and thereby categorised as an accident by the authority. Bit of history. The flight departed Melbourne as planned at 10:30 in the evening using the almost 12,000-foot-long runway 16. However, after exhausting the entire length of the runway, the aircraft failed to become airborne. 3,422 feet, that's just over 1,000 metres before the end of the runway, travelling at a speed of 270 kilometres per hour, 168 miles per hour, the captain ordered the first officer to rotate. As the aircraft pitched upward and failed to leave the ground, the tail section crashed onto the ground and continued to scrape along the runway. According to the crew, the captain took over the controls and applied maximum thrust on all 4 engines, in other words, the toga setting, and as a result, the aircraft eventually left the ground. But by 558 feet or 170 metres beyond the end of the runway, it was able to achieve an altitude of only 2 feet, 70 centimetres above the ground. Subsequently, it took out a 200-metre, just over 600-foot stretch of strobe lights at the end of the runway and continued to climb with difficulties. At 350 metres, just over 1,000 feet beyond the end of the runway, the landing gear hit and damaged the 6-foot-high or 180-centimetre-high localizer antenna array operated by Air Services Australia. At 500 metres, 1,600 feet beyond the end of the runway, the aircraft barely missed the 2.24-metre or 7-foot-tall airport perimeter fence. It was also reported that after clearing the airport perimeter, the aircraft cleared a small brick building by only 50 centimetres. 20 inches. The aircraft eventually climbed away over Port Phillip Bay. The pilots finished dumping fuel over the bay by about 11:30. Then they received a report of smoke in the cabin. They requested an immediate return, which ATC granted. They returned to the airport at about 11:30 without further incident. And in the aftermath, despite having tail strike protection built into the aircraft, it was later determined that the rear pressure bulkhead and the underlying structure were severely damaged during the takeoff roll when the pilots attempted to rotate and the tail struck the runway with considerable force. And the aircraft also suffered extensive damage to the hull as it scraped along the runway, a large surface having been completely stripped from its external sheet. The accident investigation was performed by the Australian Transportation Safety Bureau. During the investigation, it was discovered that the jet had experienced at least 1, possibly 3 or more tail strikes during previous takeoff rolls. The jet was broken down to the underlying ribs or stringers in one area, in a part of the tail structure where the critical rear pressure bulkhead may also have been damaged. A preliminary interim report suggested that the takeoff weight used to calculate takeoff power was understated by 100 tonnes when the first officer entered 262.9 instead of 362.9 tonnes into the electronic flight bag system. The aircraft was not written off, but was instead returned to Airbus by the way of a low-altitude flight without pressurisation, routed from Melbourne to Toulouse in June 2009. They went via Perth, Singapore, Dubai and Cairo, with the crew flying below 12,000 feet. And the aircraft went back into revenue service on December 1st, 2009 and remained in service operating short to medium-haul international flights out of Dubai. It was withdrawn from service in October 2014. The accident has been described as close as we will ever come to a major catastrophe in Australia by aviation officials. So a massive error in the entry of the takeoff weight data seemed to be behind that one. But that's an interesting story relating to, in this case, A6ERG, the registration of that particular aircraft. The final Emirates Airbus A340-500 flight is on October the 3rd, EK641, from Kabul to Dubai. The aircraft is A6ERE, Echo Romeo Echo. And that will end A340-500 service in Emirates. And back home, here's a story that will interest you if you are one of those wine-obsessed people. Wine flights on track for November. This is interesting. Reported in the Business Day section of Stuff on the 29th of September, a Marlborough airline, Sounds Air, is making it easier for wine professionals and tourists to travel between the top 2 wine-producing regions in the country. The Cotamiko-based company, Sounds Air, will start flying between Blenheim and Napier from November 5. That's Cotamiko, just south of Picton. They've got a really cute little operation there. Anyway, the general manager, Andrew Crawford, said there was a demand from people in the wine industry who commuted between Marlborough and Hawke's Bay. To travel between the regions was expensive and time-consuming as passengers had to go through Wellington. It's providing a service that's been required for a long time, he said. Flying between Blenheim and Napier on Air New Zealand took close to 2 hours, cost passengers about $300. The new Sounds Air service, which would operate 4 times a week, reduced the flight time to 55 minutes, with passengers paying $249 each way. Although it was primarily aimed at the wine industry, Crawford said the company included weekend times to capitalise on tourism. And Wine Marlborough General Manager Marcus Picken said the service was good news for his industry. There will definitely be demand, he said. Hawke's Bay Wine Growers Executive Officer James Medina said the new route would help businesses with interests across both regions to coordinate better, as well as saving time and money. And that's a very smart entrepreneurial move from Sounds Air. Of course, they're flying the Pilatus PC-12. That makes it totally doable. I'm used to seeing that aircraft flying across Wellington skies now. It looks very sleek, it moves very quickly, and obviously opening up new opportunities for Sounds Air. So good luck to them. The service starts in November. It's a direct service, $249 each way between Blenheim and Napier, the two wine-growing regions of New Zealand. November 5 is the start date. In just a few moments, we'll get on to talking about the big space story. Well, is it the big space story of the week, the month, the year, the millennia, or in the history of humanity? Yeah, well, it depends on how you think about it, I guess. But the NASA announcement that there is running water on Mars has been a huge story this week, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, the big story that's getting a lot of comment in aviation circles is the announcement that Russia is closing airspace to Ukraine Airlines from October 25th. They said Monday this week that they would close their airspace to Ukrainian airlines from October 25th in reprisal for a ban that Ukraine has slapped on two Russian firms. Acting on instructions from Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, the Federal Transport Agency has been asked to inform the Ukrainian air companies providing flights to Russia that they will be forbidden to use Russian airspace from the 25th of October, reported by the official TASS news agency, quoting a Transport Ministry spokesman. As I mentioned, and I'm reading from the Yahoo news site here, the measure is in response to a decision by the Ukrainian authorities last week that banned the Russian companies Aeroflot and Transaero from flying into their country, also from the 25th of October, the two big passenger airlines in Russia, Aeroflot and Transaero. Russian transit flights will also be banned if the aircraft carry military personnel or dual-use goods, under the decision announced in Kiev. The move, aimed at punishing Russia for its annexation of Crimea and alleged support for ethnic Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine, was branded by Moscow as an act of madness. On September 16th, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko expanded a list of sanctions against Russian companies and individuals, targeting 400 officials and 90 companies. And of course, we should remember that the Ukraine is a big producer of aircraft as well, home to Antonov. And they've been a supplier to the Russian military over many years. So it'll be interesting to see how that one turns out and how long that mutual ban will last for. Now, to finish this week's program, the story, well, I think the story of the millennia, at least. NASA scientists find evidence of flowing water on Mars was the anticipation over last weekend. And then sure enough, on Monday, that was the headline that graced many of the science websites and all the top news sites. Researchers say discovery of stains from summertime flows down cliffs and crater walls on Mars increases the chance of finding life on the red planet. Liquid water, I'm reading from the Guardian article here, it says the trickles leave long dark stains on the Martian terrain that can reach hundreds of meters downhill in the warmer months before they dry up in the autumn as surface temperatures drop. Images taken from the Mars orbit show cliffs and the steep walls of valleys and craters streaked with summertime flows that in the most active spots combine to form intricate fan-like patterns. Scientists are unsure where the water comes from, but it may rise up from underground ice or salty aquifers or condense out of the thin Martian atmosphere. They don't know. There is liquid water on the surface of Mars, says Michael Mayer, the lead scientist on NASA's Mars exploration program. Because of this, he told The Guardian, we suspect that it's at least possible to have a habitable environment today. The water flows could point NASA and other space agencies towards the most promising sites to find life on Mars and to landing spots for future human missions where water can be collected from a natural supply. Mars is not the dry, arid planet that we thought of in the past, said NASA's Jim Green. Liquid water has been found on Mars. Some of the earliest missions to Mars revealed a planet with a watery past. Pictures beamed back to Earth in the 1970s showed a surface crossed by dried-up rivers and plains once submerged beneath vast ancient lakes. And earlier this year, NASA unveiled evidence of an ocean that might have covered half of the planet's northern hemisphere in the distant past. Occasionally, Mars probes have found hints that the planet might still be wet. Nearly a decade ago, NASA's Mars Global Surveyor took pictures of what appeared to be water bursting through a gully wall and flowing around boulders and other rocky debris. And in 2011, the high-resolution camera on NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured what looked like little streams flowing down crater walls from late spring to early autumn. For now, researchers are focused on learning where the water comes from. Porous rocks under the Martian surface might hold frozen water that melts in the summer months and seeps up to the surface. Another possibility is that highly concentrated saline aquifers are dotted around beneath the surface, not as pools of water, but as saturated volumes of gritty rock. These could cause flows in some areas, but cannot easily explain water seeping down from the top of crater walls. A third possibility is that salts on the Martian surface absorb water from the atmosphere until they've had enough to run downhill. The process, known as deliquescence, is seen in the Atacama Desert, where the resulting damp patches are the only known place for microbes to live. So, an incredible announcement in space news this week. There is running water on Mars. NASA has confirmed it. And that's our program for another 2 weeks. Martin definitely back for the next program. Until then, this is Paul Brennan in Wellington. See you around.